nuclear security is nothing if not secret. We're not talking about safety linked to the risk of accidents, but the risk of terrorist attacks, sabotage, or planned explosions.
This is the most immediate and extreme threat to global security.
Is a nuclear attack possible? This is a question which remains absolutely taboo. Whether we're talking about the credibility of a threat or the measures in the event of an attack, national security dictates that nobody has the right to know, neither civilians nor the media, nor even the majority of political leaders.
I can't go into detail because it's secret.
In nuclear security, it would be wrong to reveal any information which might help our enemies.
This is confidential information.
Is the answer yes or no? I'm not asking...
No, I'm not going to answer.
Even the experts to whom governments entrust the monitoring of the nuclear sector are often kept powerless and at a distance.
Nothing. I personally, nothing.
When I talked about this, I came under enormous pressure. Why are you talking about this? Who authorized you to speak about this?
In the face of today's terrorist threat, is simply trusting the authorities good enough?
We're Greenpeace!
It wouldn't even take sophisticated weapons to overcome the escort. They'd be powerless.
We've chosen not to reveal any of the most sensitive information. This film has taken 2 years of investigations in which we try to answer the question which concerns us all. Beneath the secrecy, are governments and the nuclear industry capable of guaranteeing our security?
One of the main lessons of September 11th is don't underestimate the adversary.
On March the 22nd, 2016, 2 terrorists exploded a bomb right in the middle of Brussels airport in Belgium. A third terrorist blew himself up in the Malbec metro station. Islamic State claimed responsibility for these attacks, which killed 32 people and left 340 wounded. The police investigation uncovered some extremely worrying information. The Brussels attacks enabled them to make a direct link between terrorism and the nuclear world. The suicide bombers who carried out the Brussels attacks came from the same terrorist cell which carried out the attacks in Paris on November the 13th, 2015. They had installed a camera opposite the home of the head of the Belgian Nuclear Research Centre. This centre holds enormous amounts of radioactive and nuclear material. The terrorists were secretly tracking the director's every movement. In a video seized in a police raid a few months before the Brussels attacks, 2 men can be seen setting up the camera in the middle of the night and driving away with their headlights off. The police subsequently found out that these 2 men were none other than the El Bakraoui brothers, the suicide bombers of the Brussels airport and metro.
Most disturbingly, most alarmingly, we know that ISIS was conducting surveillance on a senior nuclear official from this very reactor site. I think is the first time we have a radical Islamic terrorist group that wants to get nuclear weapons.
There's a theory that says that these guys were chased by the police and they had to hurry up. And that's why they didn't blow up the nuclear facility, but just the more easy target, the airport and the metro.
In Washington, the National Consortium for the Study of Terrorism and Responses to Terrorism, START, is the world's biggest university research institute dedicated to global terrorism. One department is specialized in non-conventional weapons, and its researchers gather information on the threat of radiological and nuclear terrorism. They help the American government to improve its defense strategies. The consortium has a database which lists every attack against nuclear installations since the very beginnings of this technology.
Many people might think that the threat of attacks on nuclear facilities is a small threat, and we don't imagine there have been many attacks. It's just hypothetical. However, according to our nuclear facilities attack database, or NUFAD, there have been over 83 attacks on nuclear facilities in the last 60 years. Some of them have been minor attacks by environmental activists, but some of them have actually been very serious attacks that have breached very far into these facilities by very dangerous actors. So the idea of nuclear facilities being attacked is definitely not far-fetched.
1961, United States.
1973, Argentina. 15 armed men forced their way into the Atusha nuclear
have planted a bomb in a steam turbine.
Democratic Republic of the Congo.
300 kilos of fissile material have been stolen from the
26 bombs have been discovered inside the Bataan nuclear power
Four gunmen
plant.
have entered the Pelindaba nuclear facility in South Africa, killing one man. In the
drones are flying above every nuclear power plant in France.
If you really want to kill a very large amount of people or cause great destruction on the scale that can only be done by states, one of the only ways of doing this is through nuclear radiological, at least nuclear weapons. So for terrorists who want to have great effects in terms of killing a lot of people, destroying a lot of physical infrastructure, or even just denying the use of an area, causing economic impact, these are very useful weapons.
Well, I fear today that we have the most credible threats that we've ever had. Because what we have in the Middle East is ISIL. And we see they've already crossed the boundary on weapons of mass destruction. They're making their own mustard gas. They're using it on innocent civilians. And if they've already crossed that barrier from conventional to unconventional weapons, I think we have to assume that if they had access to nuclear or radiological material, that they might find a way to do severe harm.
Nuclear power plants, along with uranium enrichment facilities, spent fuel reprocessing and storage sites are exposed to attacks from all sides. Suicide plane or drone attacks from above, attacks from boats by river or sea, commando attacks from the ground. And with the advance in new technologies, the threat of cyber attacks is more and more prevalent. But it's not just nuclear facilities that are vulnerable. Nuclear and radioactive material are also exposed. Terrorists can use them to construct dirty bombs, or even worse, an improvised nuclear bomb. Highly enriched uranium, HEU, is the most problematic and the most sought-after material. The military use it to build nuclear weapons, but it's also utilized in certain civilian reactors to produce radioisotopes, which help in the diagnostics and treatment of diseases such as cancer. This is precisely what the Belgium Nuclear Research Centre does. The centre, whose director was spied on by the terrorists responsible for the Brussels and Paris attacks. It's possible that highly enriched uranium was what the terrorists were targeting.
I've focused on highly enriched uranium for 30 years because it, in my mind, is the easiest path to a terrorist exploding a real nuclear weapon. And the reason is that this material is very easy to handle, very safe. I could give it to you, there would be no danger to you of becoming irradiated. So it's very easy to handle, it's very easy to disguise. So if you just wrap it with some lead, you can walk through a detector and it won't detect that you have highly enriched uranium. We had a scientist from the Manhattan Project, Luis Alvarez, who said that once you have the HEU, the bomb-grade uranium, then actually making the nuclear weapon is trivial. Those are his words, not my words. He said even a high school student could do it. This is someone with great familiarity because he helped design the first nuclear weapon that the United States ever used. You would need at least 25 kilograms and ideally around 50 kilograms of highly enriched uranium. And if you had that, you could essentially make a bomb as easily as taking one half and dropping it on the other half. You would get this chain reaction and this thing would explode. And you would get a multi-kiloton yield. Hiroshima, tens of thousands dead.
Ever since the Japanese cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki were destroyed by the American Air Force in August 1945, the atomic bomb has become the symbol of the apocalypse. The consequences of a nuclear conflict would be so dramatic that no other country possessing the bomb has used it since. But certain terrorist organizations, whose goal is to cause as many casualties as possible, have tried on several occasions to get hold of nuclear material in order to make a bomb.
However, there are only 3 organizations that have actually had serious plots. The first of these that we can discuss is Aum Shinrikyo, which was the apocalyptic millenarian Japanese cult. The cult leader was one of those people who was obsessed with weapons of mass destruction, and he thought that the world would end in a big nuclear cataclysm, so he wanted to be the one who would acquire this and have control over these weapons. So his group actually attempted to obtain the plans and the designs for nuclear weapons, and even from materials from both Japan and from Russia. And they had some success in at least getting some information. And then they bought a sheep ranch in Australia, which they set up potentially a facility to build a nuclear weapon. We also know that they had no success whatsoever in their attempts. The next major actor, terrorist actor, to be interested in nuclear weapons was Al-Qaeda. Osama bin Laden, as early as the early 1990s, showed an interest in this, and on several occasions they tried to acquire through buying fissile material. They defended themselves ideologically, saying, yes, this is something we can do, and this is something that's a duty if we can do it.
They wanted a lot of people dead, and the most efficient way to kill a lot of people is with an improvised nuclear device or some kind of a weapon of mass destruction. And so their ideology was consistent with the kind of apocalyptic damage that nuclear and other weapons of mass destruction can have.
Between 1993 and 1994, Al-Qaeda tried to get their hands on highly enriched uranium from the Sudan to use it in a nuclear device. For the first time, this was proof that Osama bin Laden had been trying to fabricate an improvised nuclear bomb. During an interview carried out in January 1999 by the weekly Time magazine, a journalist asked him if he had tried to procure chemical or nuclear weapons. Bin Laden replied, "If I seek to acquire these weapons, I'm carrying out a duty. It would be a sin for Muslims not to try to possess the weapons that would prevent the infidels from inflicting harm on Muslims."
In the case of Al-Qaeda, they had a particular designated nuclear CEO. They had a fairly focused program with repeated attempts to get nuclear material, get nuclear expertise. They went as far as actually carrying out some crude tests of conventional explosives for their nuclear weapons program in the desert in Afghanistan. And by the way, we have no idea where this nuclear CEO is today or what he's been doing for the last decade. We don't have similar evidence about the Islamic State. We don't have evidence of a focused Islamic State nuclear weapons program. But we do have these troubling indicators from recent events in Belgium. And if the Islamic State ever did turn to nuclear pursuits, they have more money, more people, more territory under control, more ability to recruit experts from around the world than Al-Qaeda at its strongest ever had.
On June the 10th, 2014, ISIS fighters captured Mosul, Iraq's second-largest city. A month later, the Iraqi ambassador to the UN announced that jihadists had got their hands on a 40-kilogram supply of uranium at the University of Mosul. The uranium was being used for scientific research. The International Atomic Energy Agency tried to reassure the public. Since the stolen uranium was not enriched, it could not be used to make a weapon. But this incident highlighted the inadequacies of the Iraqi authorities, supported by the US, in ensuring the security of nuclear material. Why hadn't the uranium been removed to a safe location? And yet back in 2009 in Prague, in a speech that was to become historic, American President Barack Obama had promised to fight nuclear terrorism.
We must ensure that terrorists never acquire a nuclear weapon. This is the most immediate and extreme threat to global security. Al-Qaeda has said it seeks a bomb and that it would have no problem with using it. And we know that there is unsecured nuclear material across the globe. To protect our people, we must act with a sense of purpose, without delay.
Barack Obama has always been very concerned with nuclear issues. As president, he organized in 2010 in Washington the biggest gathering of heads of states, prime ministers, and reigning monarchs ever seen to discuss nuclear security. The 47 countries represented all recognized the urgency of improving the security of their nuclear materials, and they committed to carry out concrete measures.
It was a way to say, highlight the things and give countries a reason to take those political steps to remove highly enriched uranium from a facility where it was no longer being used, to ratify a treaty, to invite a peer review of your nuclear security at your facilities.
The Nuclear Security Summit was such a success that Obama decided to organize summits every 2 years, forcing countries to stick to their engagements and to make additional ones. These summits enabled huge quantities of nuclear material to be secured throughout the world.
As of today, South America, an entire continent, is completely free of these dangerous materials. When Poland completes its removal this year, Central Europe will be free of them as well. When Indonesia completes its work this year, so will all of Southeast Asia. In other words, as terrorists and criminal gangs and arms merchants look around for deadly ingredients for a nuclear device, vast regions of the world are now off limits, and that is a remarkable achievement.
In 2016, at the last Nuclear Security Summit, President Obama was proud to lay out his track record. However, many experts were less optimistic. There is still plenty of work to be done, and terrorist attacks are on the increase across the globe.
There's still nuclear material, 24 countries around the world, radioactive material in over 130 countries. The job of locking those down is not done. Reports that people have been trying to smuggle nuclear material that could be used in a bomb. So we cannot rest and just hope for the best. We have to take action.
Action must be taken, but Russia has refused to take part in the 4th Nuclear Security Summit, even though they've been present from the outset. The Russian and American governments are no longer cooperating, despite having worked closely together since the fall of the USSR. Since 1991, the Americans have invested $16 billion in securing nuclear material spread throughout the whole of the former Soviet Union. American experts regularly visited Russian nuclear sites to check that their money was being wisely spent. But Vladimir Putin decided to change strategy, pulling his country in a nationalist direction, and he stopped any further verification of nuclear sites by American experts. The absence of Russia from the Nuclear Security Summit has raised serious questions. How can the international community fight terrorism efficiently without the participation of this major country, who alone possesses half of the world's strategic nuclear materials?
Because Mr. Putin came into power, and because of the vision that he's been pursuing of emphasizing military might over development inside of Russia and diversifying the economy, we have not seen the kind of progress that I would have hoped for with Russia.
The end of the Obama presidency has also marked the end of the Nuclear Security Summits. Obama's successor, Donald Trump, announced that he will not be continuing the initiative. So now it's up to the IAEA, the International Atomic Energy Agency, based in Vienna in Austria, to take over. Made up of 193 member countries, the role of the agency is to promote the peaceful uses of nuclear energy and to ensure that countries who don't hold nuclear weapons do not try to obtain them. But the fight against the terrorist threat was not part of the mission of the agency when it was set up in 1957. The IAEA is an organization which does the bidding of its members. It has no power to force a country to get rid of or even to secure its nuclear materials and other radioactive substances.
I think leaves a gap in the system because there really is no set of international standards that all countries have to follow. That is sort of unbelievable when you think about the consequences of a misuse of nuclear material, that these dangerous materials are really not regulated internationally in any way. So one thing you'd look for is countries to actually commit to implement the IAEA guidance. This is not a technical problem, it's a political problem.
Beyond the global political problem, there's also the issue of the political will of nuclear weapon states. The IAEA has no access to civilian facilities, even though more than 95% of the plutonium and highly enriched uranium in the world is stored in these states. So contrary to expectations, the agency has no power to carry out an important part of its mission on the entirety of nuclear facilities and materials. Uranium and plutonium are not the only substances that can be used in an attack. Terrorists can make use of all sorts of different radioactive material to assemble what is called a dirty bomb. In contrast to an improvised nuclear device, which would produce a real nuclear explosion, dirty bombs are concocted from conventional explosive material, such as plastic or powder, to which the terrorists would add highly radioactive substances, such as those found in hospitals or in the building industry, or even highly radioactive waste. The explosion would then spread radioactivity into the environment.
What you want for a dirty bomb is things that are really radioactive, so there's a lot of radiation when you spread it over an area. So that you're looking at things like cesium-137, cobalt-60, iridium-192, things like that. Well, unfortunately, they exist in pretty much every country. They exist in thousands of buildings around the world. Hospitals, industrial sites, in few countries they're even in use in agriculture, for example, for sterilizing seeds.
Radiation is also invisible. It's intangible. You don't know, have I been exposed? How much have I been exposed? So the lack of certainty of exposure causes more anxiety than with other threats like bombs or guns that terrorists might use. Radiological weapons are not going to destroy very much, and they're not going to kill many people, but they can deny large areas. They can contaminate large areas, a large-scale radiological weapon, which makes those areas unusable, and it causes large-scale economic damage.
Radioactive substances used in dirty bombs are not always guarded securely either. The IAEA has a database listing all the thefts and losses that have been registered throughout the world. Between 1993 and 2015, 762 cases have been reported. In most instances, the missing material has never been recovered. The agency admits the likelihood that trafficking is involved.
In reality, we have some indications, we have some symptoms from the experience that some groups have tried to obtain nuclear materials. We can't rule out possibility that some criminals would like to use the nuclear materials or the nuclear facilities for their malicious purposes.
In the late 1990s, Chechen rebels put together a dirty bomb intended to be used in their conflict with Russia. On that day, the world nearly succumbed to its first large-scale radiological attack. First, the rebels buried the explosive device in the middle of a Moscow park, and then they tipped off journalists. They claimed that they never had any intention of exploding the bomb. It was simply a means of showing the Russian government that they were capable of carrying out such a nuclear attack. Easy to make, hard to protect source material. This is what leads countries to raise the threat level of attack by dirty bomb to critical. Risk protection can only come about by prioritizing the fight against material trafficking. For For years, START researchers in Washington have been studying all the clandestine routes used by the criminal networks. They've linked together vast amounts of data about travel routes, means of transport, border crossings and customs, enabling them to develop software which can calculate the routes that traffickers might take when secretly transporting nuclear material.
We had people on the ground looking, going to places, talking to people. We also interview experts around the world. And where needed, where we can, we will even interview the terrorists themselves or former terrorists to try and understand their thinking about how they make decisions about some of these issues. So the overall point of doing all of this is to guide our counterterrorism agencies into where they're most likely to be able to interdict terrorists that are trying, or other smugglers that are trying to smuggle nuclear and radiological materials.
For our film, START researchers have agreed to calculate the route that terrorists might take to transport radioactive material to Paris from Niger, a country with low security and where many jihadists are to be found. They told us it would take them several weeks to come up with their results. So as not to divulge any information to potential traffickers, the START researchers modified one of the settings in their calculations.
They managed to acquire 300 grams of cesium-137 from a medical supply company in Niger. They drive from Niamey all the way for 7 hours to Tahua Airport. At Tahua Airport, they charter a plane posing as Nigerian businessmen who are going to London for a few days. So they take the plane with the material and then they refuel in Blida, Algeria. Then they fly over France. But however, when they're near Moissel, there's a small aeroclub engine, Moissel. The co-pilot and the pilot report that there are technical difficulties with the plane and they need to land. Now, because they have planned this beforehand, for many months they have managed to get an insider at Aeroclub Engine Moissel. The material now is with the insider at the airport and they start heading towards Paris. People might ask, is this not too complicated? Well, if you look at the Bataclan attackers, they were coordinated from Syria. There was months' worth of planning, moving people, materials into Belgium, into France. That was a very complex attack, and this attack is no more complex than that. We would be very silly and naive to think that these materials could not be smuggled, especially in a region like Europe, where once you're inside some borders, there are very little controls between countries. Radiological and nuclear material smuggling, it is definitely a reality.
Yet the largest amount of nuclear material moved around is not made up of clandestine traffic. Plutonium, uranium and highly radioactive waste are all transported every day by the nuclear industry in huge quantities across the planet. In Cherbourg, Yannick Rousselet, the head of Greenpeace France's anti-nuclear campaign, has spent time investigating all these shipments. He's just had an unexpected visit from the police.
In the end, 4 of them turned up wearing police armbands at about 8 o'clock in the morning. They ended up taking all my digital devices, computers, telephone, memory sticks.
The police seized documents that Greenpeace have been compiling about the shipments of plutonium produced at La Hague facility. The government would like the information to be kept secret. This material used in the construction of nuclear bombs carries an extremely high risk of causing cancer in local residents if found in air, food or water. Areva uses plutonium to make nuclear fuel, but there's a serious industrial anomaly. Although the plutonium is produced in La Hague, the plant which then transforms it is in Marcoule, which is a full 800 kilometers away at the opposite end of the country. Every year, more than 10 tons of plutonium crosses France in this way. In the Greenpeace offices, Yannick Rousselet has kept a copy of the seized documents.
It's wishful thinking to believe that the secrecy is part of the method of protection. I was very clear with the authorities and asked them to give me 6 months. If in 6 months I'm not able to tell you which type of truck, its schedule and its number plate, then okay, the notion of secrecy is working. Above all, our duty is to blow the whistle once we realise that there's a serious weak link in the system. Notwithstanding the limits imposed on us, we have a duty as an NGO to highlight the problem. Here's a map of the Manche region with the La Hague site here and the exit, which is here. So, in fact, all this stretch right up to this fork here is the only route that the convoys of plutonium, which leave La Hague every week, can take. Starting from the Arriva plant, I'm going to show you the route the trucks take, and I can demonstrate how vulnerable these nuclear convoys are. Basically, every week there's a convoy of 1 or 2 semi-trailer trucks, escorted the whole way over more than 1,000 kilometres. So here, coming up, we get to a rather unusual spot where the traffic all of a sudden becomes one way as the road narrows. The trucks are forced to slow right down here in order to go under this rather small bridge. It's clear to us that this is a weak spot. Here we're in the middle of a residential area. Here too, the problem is that those in charge of the security of the convoys can have absolutely no control over who might be waiting in one of the houses. Now here we're coming to a bridge which in theory is reserved for farm vehicles only, but as you can see crosses over the road and is inaccessible from below. This means that we're right above the convoy.
Greenpeace is going to test the security of the convoys in real conditions. Simple observation has enabled them to map out the different routes and frequencies of these secret transports. Yannick Rousselet has got together with activists to plan a sensitive operation, testing how far it's possible to follow these transports, to predict their exact timetables and to get close to them.
So, our weekly investigations have shown that the shipments follow a strict routine because systematically they take place on Mondays. And we've also studied the timings over the whole route. And it turns out that within 2 minutes, really 2 minutes either way, we know exactly when the convoy will pass by. So we have 4 options. Option number 1 is when they go via Le Havre, so they go all the way around by the north. Option 2 is the shortest option, and the one they use the most often, is taking the Normandy motorway. Option 3 is Caen, and the longest route is via Rennes, Nantes, and then they continue down to Bordeaux, with a stopover at a military barracks in Saintes. So that's why we need to use several cars tomorrow, so as to be sure not to lose them.
And action.
It's very early. It's 6 o'clock. We're going to another roundabout, where we'll have a better view.
Natalie is hiding out near a junction close to La Hague facility. Her role is to wait for the convoy to pass by and give the green light for the start of the operation.
I've parked out of sight, so that we're not spotted. We have to be patient.
Yannick makes his way a bit further along the convoy's route to the bridge that he'd earmarked the day before. If everything goes to plan, he'll be able to observe the exact moment when the trucks pass underneath. After 4 hours of waiting, the convoy comes by as planned.
So they're going to block the junction. 1 truck. Okay, that's all good. That's very good.
Hello?
Hi, yeah, the convoy has just gone past.
Okay, great. So it'll be here in roughly 13 to 15 minutes. Here they come. There's the leading car first. Yes, that's the one. So we can now go onto the bridge. If there was anyone here on the bridge with criminal intent, it's clear that it wouldn't even take sophisticated weapons to overcome the escort. They'd be totally powerless. So there you can see the convoy arriving now, protected by escort cars.
In 2003, the Institute for Radio Protection and Nuclear Safety led a study into the resistance of containers transporting plutonium to an attack by an anti-tank missile. Inside the trucks, the outside of the containers are specially equipped with neutron-shielding material, inside of which there are several layers of stainless steel. The plutonium powder is stocked in these sealed containers. In all, each truck transports around 150 kilograms of plutonium powder. The results of the IRNS study showed that an anti-tank missile would pass right through a first container and damage a second. Plutonium would therefore be released into the environment. These results are all the more worrying as the anti-tank rocket launcher, the RPG-7 used in attacks against armoured vans and by terrorists, is one of the biggest selling weapons on the black market after Kalashnikovs. We followed the convoy for hundreds of kilometres without ever losing them. We often managed to overtake them.
The system is really not very secure. Look, we're no more than a couple of metres away.
We filmed the convoy from another bridge. And we overtook them again, without ever being spotted or stopped. In the course of other tailing operations, Greenpeace activists found out something else about these high-risk shipments. The trucks stop regularly for fuel at motorway services, and the service stations they use are almost always the same ones. The secrecy surrounding these convoys is not sufficient enough to protect them. And yet every year, about 100 trucks ship plutonium in this way across France. Vulnerable transport is one thing, but every nuclear facility is also a potential target, particularly where there are reactors. There are more than 400 spread throughout the whole world. Most of them were designed and built at a time when a terrorist attack against them was unthinkable. Until the day when everything changed.
When the second plane crashed into the tower, it became clear that it was an intentional act, that there was a plan behind it. And it didn't take long to start thinking about what it might mean for other types of buildings. Because a similar incident with a plane crashing into an operational nuclear reactor would bring about an even greater catastrophe.
The investigation inquiry into the 9/11 attacks revealed Al-Qaeda's original plans. There were to be 10 planes and 10 targets, including a nuclear power plant. Mohammed Atta, the mastermind of 9/11, admitted that he had thought up the idea when flying over the Indian Point power plant close to New York during the flying lessons that he'd taken in preparation for the attacks. Overnight, every country equipped with nuclear capacity was forced to answer a question that they'd never asked before. Could a nuclear reactor resist a big airliner crashing into it?
France was no more prepared than any other country for such a scenario. The threat of an incident with a plane had been evaluated, but only with light planes, which might have crashed into a plant by accident or human error. But no one had considered the possibility that a large passenger plane, that is a heavy, solid flying machine filled with fuel, could be deliberately flown into a nuclear plant.
When nuclear reactors were designed before 9/11, how had their level of resistance been defined? The French Nuclear Safety Authority published an article in September 2001, just after the attack, in an attempt to answer this difficult question. The risk of terrorism had never been taken into account. Engineers had only judged the risk of a plane crashing into a reactor by accident. That probability was not considered strong enough for big commercial airliners or military planes, and so it was ignored. Only the consequences of a small plane accident had been considered. All previous decisions based on accident probability were destroyed by the 9/11 attacks. Every country with nuclear facilities had to rethink their strategy.
After 2001, there was a lot of thought put into calculating what exactly the impact of a plane with fuel and the consequences might be. In such matters of critical security, it would be wrong to reveal any information which might help our enemies. And so the results of these calculations were kept secret.
With a few rare exceptions, most reactors have not been reinforced since 9/11. Governments have simply reworked their calculations of resistance, but the results remain classified. This silence is justified by the need to maintain the reactor security and also enables the nuclear industry to reassure the public.
After 9/11, we obviously readdressed the question of a possible plane crash, particularly of a malicious nature, on one of our power plants. This was something which had been studied and taken into consideration during the design and construction of our plants. That's to say that we certainly have thick layers of concrete, including extremely important amounts of reinforced concrete, around the most significant areas, which can resist impact by planes, which we took into account back then. Since then, we've reworked our calculations concerning the bigger size aircrafts, since things have also evolved in that area. And I can personally assure you that the structures are extremely resistant, and there is no way that a potential plane crash into a nuclear power plant could lead to a serious accident.
If the French nuclear industry is able to guarantee that there is no risk, what about in the United States, the country which has the most reactors in the world? The Nuclear Energy Institute, the NEI, based in Washington, is the nuclear sector's lobby group, which defends the interests of 300 businesses, including the owners of nuclear plants.
What I think we learned from the aircraft impact studies that were done after 9/11 in terms of attempting to hit it within a wide-bodied aircraft, and the impact assessments that were done demonstrated that the design of the containment building and the auxiliary buildings that house the equipment that we're relying on to protect the public can withstand that impact.
Which particular study allows you to say that a nuclear power plant would withstand an airplane crash?
Well, if you just take a minute to allow me to double check my notes.
The head of communications at NEI needs a little time to find the study report in question. 2 months later, the only study that his office could come up with was a YouTube link,
Technical Research Center of
a promotional film for a Finnish research centre specialising in material resistance testing.
Contract research organization in Northern Europe.
It is very important to test this phenomenon.
Trying a little too hard to convince, the film says over and over again that studies are very important for security, but gives no specific results. The mystery of whether nuclear plants are able to resist a plane crash remains. In Belgium, Jean-Marc Nollet is a member of parliament for Ecolo, the Green Party. Nuclear issues are one of his main concerns. He's fighting the lack of transparency in the sector, and he sees it as his political duty to inform people and help to protect them better. Today, we're accompanying him on a reconnaissance flight around the Tihange nuclear power station. What makes this site particularly noteworthy, if hard to believe in the present context, is that it's situated on the flight path of the runway of Liège Airport. There are only 16 kilometers separating the airport from the plant. A plane taking off is only 2.5 minutes from the nuclear facility. As well as catering for passenger flights, Liège Airport is the 8th largest airport in Europe for freight transport. There are a total of 30,000 takeoffs and landings every year. We were able to fly within a few hundred meters of the power plant and circle it several times with no trouble at all. The nuclear plant of Tihange has 3 reactors, but it also has another weak spot. Nuclear waste is stored on site in a building housing 8 large spent fuel pools. These add up to 600 cubic meters of highly radioactive irradiated fuels, the equivalent of 80 nuclear reactor cores.
I didn't realize just how close the nuclear plant is to the airport here at Biarzée. When you see the situation with your own eyes, both the proximity and the potential risk, it's obvious that someone with malicious intent could cause a lot of damage. The Minister must tell us what measures are in place and, above all, what guarantees he can give in regards of planes using the runway here at Biarzée.
Back in the Deputy's chamber, Jean-Marc Nollet makes his way to a meeting with Yann Yambon, Minister of the Interior. He aims to ask him questions about the situation in Tihange.
Minister, can you give us a guarantee that these buildings will resist, particularly in the event of a crash of a Boeing 747, and not just of a small, light aircraft? I'm really talking about the B-747s which take off and land at Biarzée.
The information concerning the type of plane used in the studies is confidential and cannot be published. The exact thickness of these buildings is confidential and cannot be published.
Why is that?
Look, I don't know, but it's clear that I really can't tell you because the reason is the type of plane and so on and so forth. Well, this is all confidential information.
But why? Since it's an established fact that at Liège, these planes are flying over the site, can we have a guarantee that the plant and the spent fuel pools too are capable of resisting a plane crash?
It's confidential information.
But is the answer yes or no? I'm not asking you...
No, I'm not going to answer.
So I'm going to have to tell the people that we don't actually know if the nuclear plant is capable of resisting this type of airliner.
You don't know that?
Yes.
That's true, because the information...
And you can't tell them...
Because it's confidential.
That's enough.
I understand, but you cannot give them...
We're going to stop now.
No, come on, Mr. Chairman, I understand. You cannot give them, at this point in time, any reassurance?
But I'm telling you that no additional measures need to be taken, so...
But we can't reassure them. And it's very regrettable that you must be held to secrecy, which means that you can't simply reassure and simply inform people.
The matter is closed, Mr. Nollet.
Closed?
Next question.
That remains to be seen.
True, but the matter is closed for today.
For today, exactly. You know me well. There are too many things which are confidential. What's more, when you read this report called Man-Made Events, which was compiled after Fukushima, it's clear that the tests that were carried out lead to only one conclusion, that only the most recent plants are capable of withstanding an airliner crash. We can read it here. For the reactor buildings of the oldest units, significant damage to the external concrete structure, with the possibility of projectiles penetrating into the containment, cannot be excluded. What more can you say? These studies have indeed shown that there are vulnerabilities, but of course this was not made public. But we can't go out and say either that nuclear facilities would easily resist any impact from a large aircraft. Therefore, a lot of thought went into designing a new type of reactor, the EPR. It has a casing to protect it from planes. In other words, a 2-layer concrete wall which can absorb vibrations and withstand an airplane attack. So this reactor actually prefigured third-generation reactors.
The French government has raised its requirements and forced Arriva to make its new EPR resistant to impact from airliners. Its concrete layers are considerably thicker than any of the previous models. In Germany, the risk of plane crashes was a crucial factor in the decision to abandon nuclear power.
As far as the issue of attacks from planes on nuclear facilities goes, it must be pointed out that after what happened in Fukushima in March 2011, we decided, for a second time, to phase out all nuclear power plants in Germany. And one of the first measures taken was to immediately close down the 8 oldest nuclear reactors, which, in my opinion, were also the most exposed to the dangers of attack from planes. So this was a crucial decision. But in all sincerity, I won't sleep easy until the process is completed. That is, at the end of 2022, when the last operating nuclear power plant in Germany, here in Baden-Württemberg, is closed down.
In the next episode, we'll be seeing how nuclear facilities try to protect themselves in the event of an aerial attack.
The Air Force keeps 5 to 6 patrols ready to take off at a moment's notice, at any time.
We'll be finding out what the most vulnerable point of a nuclear plant is.
So what you see here is one of the 4 spent fuel pools. It's a metal roof, not dissimilar to the type of roof you find in car garages.
We'll be investigating the threat of cyber attacks.
In the long run, I do think that we will see cyber physical attacks of some type coming from terrorist groups. It's only a matter of time.
And we'll finally understand why the nuclear industry is incapable of guaranteeing our security.
Now, why did they do this? They did this because it would be expensive.